what's been in the news lately and what's been a big deal has been this all-out attack and assault on Joe Rogan. And you guys can probably guess, based on the fact that I do a long-form podcast where I interview guests, that I'm a fan of Joe Rogan, and I love what he does. I've thought about this a lot, and I think it's going to be impossible to get all of my thoughts out on this, but my general feeling is that Joe Rogan has tapped into something that all of us were craving and that we were missing and that we are not getting from the mainstream legacy media. Okay, that is long form, authentic discourse. For those of you who aren't familiar with who Joe Rogan is, which I shouldn't assume that you are, I think most people are for the most part, and a lot of people who listen to me have probably listened to some of his shows. But Joe Rogan is originally known for, well, several things. Mixed martial arts commentator, right? He's been with the UFC as a commentator forever. But before that, he was a stand-up comedian, and a very successful stand-up comedian who's toured all over, done specials on Netflix. And then, of course, he was the Fear Factor host, right? And he started this podcast back in, I think, like 2009, that was literally just him and his friends hanging out, shooting the shit, usually getting drunk and high, and just talking to fans. That was it. That's all it was. It was like a hang with his comedian friends. And Joe has never professed to be news or a journalist or an expert or anything like that. In fact, he prefaces most stuff that he puts out there with, don't listen to me, I'm just a cage fighting commentator who does stand-up comedy, right? But nonetheless, because his genuine, authentic way of having a conversation where he can admit when he's wrong, and he talks to multiple sides of the argument in terms of folks who represent ideas on multiple sides of an argument, his audience has grown massive on his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. If you haven't listened to any episodes of his podcast, I highly encourage you to. You can find them on Spotify exclusively now. And this is part of the reason we have this big issue ongoing. So Joe has on all kinds of guests, ranging from politicians to scientists to stand-up comedians to just random cool people who have written books that Joe's interested in. I mean, you name it. The entire spectrum of humanity is represented on that show for the most part. And that's what makes it amazing. And you can pick and choose which episodes you listen to. He has on folks like Alex Jones and Elon Musk. Those tend to be the super popular ones because these are enigmatic characters that everyone's interested in. But then he also has on like Dr. Rhonda Patrick, who is an incredibly knowledgeable, talented scientist who talks about molecular physiology and adaptive biochemistry and all kinds of really cool stuff that I nerd out on. And Andrew Huberman, for example, who's another scientist he has on the show. So Joe is someone who is just naturally inquisitive and curious about the world, and he's not afraid to ask questions. He never tries to put on a front like he knows everything. And so he lets his guard down and he asks people good questions about what their expertise is on and what they do in life. And this is why we enjoy it. And he does it for 3-4 hours at a time. Then also he'll have on his stand-up comedian friends, and it can turn into an absolute shit show. But it's like the raw, authentic nature of life as we know it and as we live it and as we experience it. That's why we love it. And it is the polar opposite of CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all of these news outlets where you get someone on for like a minute to 2 minutes giving a soundbite that's scripted based on their corporate sponsors about an issue that you're supposed to believe is an authentic message. It's not. And the people know that. And so we've been given a spoon feeding for the past couple years on the C word that I'm not allowed to say on YouTube probably still, but COVID-19. Okay. And Joe has had on very qualified doctors and scientists who give not even an alternative perspective, but just talk about things like treatments for COVID-19 because the narrative coming from the corporate media and our government here in America hasn't even focused on treatment. It's just been get vaccinated and that's it. But the problem, of course, is that folks get vaccinated and still catch COVID. So then what? You just hang out and wait, try to shake it off? No, there are treatments that you can undergo to mitigate the effects of the virus even more, even if you're vaccinated. And so he's had on people who have talked about early treatment and different methods and all kinds of things. And yes, talked about the vaccine, the mechanism by which it operates, the different side effects that can arise from it. And this is just natural conversation that you should have when it comes to any pharmaceuticals and any drugs. But anytime big money is involved, and you guys have probably all seen these clips where it's like brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Pfizer for like every news program out there on every network.
Good Morning America is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer.
Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This weather report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press Data Download brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Pfizer is paying these guys. So, of course, they're going to come after Rogan. Anything that paints Pfizer or Big Pharma in a negative light, they're going to attack. And it's so transparent. It's so blatantly obvious. CNN has been one of the worst, attacking him over taking ivermectin, which is, of course, an anti-parasitic drug that does have antiviral properties, that the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine was won in, I believe, 2015 for in humans, that also happens to have a veterinary application. So, of course, they skew the argument or skew the headlines saying that Joe Rogan is taking horse paste, which is just completely asinine, ridiculous. He was prescribed it by his doctor to manage his symptoms of COVID-19. So they've just been attacking this guy relentlessly, right? And you guys probably know about most of this. But recently, you may not have even heard of him. And I'll be honest, I knew who he was, but I was not intimately familiar with his music. Neil Young came out and said, basically, and he did it in an open letter format that he like put out and then quickly deleted. He said that Spotify either has to get rid of Joe Rogan or get rid of Neil Young. It's one or the other because of the, quote, misinformation that Joe Rogan puts out. First off, Joe Rogan doesn't really put out any information. He has guests on his show. Secondly, of course, Neil Young did not say specifically what any misinformation was that Joe Rogan, quote, put out. He just used the nebulous term, the nebulous talking point that the legacy mainstream media likes to throw around, and didn't give any details. Now, Spotify, of course, was like, okay, well, see you later, and removed his music because Joe Rogan, Sagar Anjetti, I think, put it the best on Breaking Points. He said, Spotify needs Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan doesn't need Spotify. And that is true. So, of course, Spotify said, well, we're keeping Rogan. He brought us God knows how many subscribers and podcast listeners. So see you later, Neil Young. And then there have been other artists from like back in the day, back in the 70s or whatever, who have said they're pulling their music. Essentially, boomer musicians are pulling their music from Spotify because of, quote, misinformation on the Joe Rogan experience. He's also been attacked by this podcaster, YouTuber guy, Ethan, I forget his last name, essentially attacking Rogan for the way he looks, which is really odd because this Ethan guy is quite, I hate even talking about people's, appearances, but he's a fat guy. He's out of shape, and Joe Rogan is clearly not. And Joe's also in his 50s. This Ethan guy is a good bit younger. and he's attacking Joe Rogan for being unhealthy, which is just preposterous. Like, it's an all-out assault on this guy. And meanwhile, a lot of it stems from the fact that they realize Joe has essentially more listeners / viewers for his one show than all of them combined. And I'm talking the networks, everyone. I think it was something like Joe has 11 million unique listeners when a new episode drops. And I don't know the time frame for that, but by comparison, CNN network wide doesn't even have 1 million each day. And that's on across all their shows, right? Network wide. So that's the scale difference here. I mean, orders of magnitude. Joe Rogan is massive. And by the way, people trust him and come to him to listen to him for information because the mainstream media has built so much distrust in the people. Not because Joe is trying to be some conveyor of truth, right? He's not saying, listen to me and what I have to say and nothing else. In fact, again, he's just having conversations, chopping it up, asking questions about things he's curious in. And it just so happens that we, the people, are like, this is way better than the crap that they're trying to feed us over at these other networks where they very clearly have an agenda and it's driven by corporate greed. But for whatever reason, they can't get that through their heads. And instead, they're trying to cancel Joe Rogan. And it keeps firing back in their face. So Spotify has conceded, I guess, that they will put like COVID warnings on episodes where he talks about COVID. Now, that's, of course, not a big deal. I mean, it's essentially saying, hey, they talk about COVID in this episode. But still, it is something that Spotify is doing in response. But we haven't seen the end of this, ladies and gentlemen. They're going to keep attacking Joe Rogan. But he is Dave Chappelle scale, if not larger, right? He's the biggest of the big. He is the largest podcast in the world, and they can't cancel him. They can't take him off the air. Even if Spotify got rid of him and threw out his contract, which I doubt they would because I'm pretty sure he gets paid no matter what, he could just go open his own app somewhere where it just streams the Joe Rogan experience, and everybody would leave Spotify that went to Spotify just to listen to Joe. People are going to go where Joe goes. He's built this thing over a decade, right? So that's been going on. It's a mess. It's always, by the way, always people, for the most part, that I see commenting and talking about Joe negatively, calling him things like alt-right, which is hilarious because he's had on Bernie Sanders, he had on Sanjay Gupta from CNN, he's had on Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang. Joe supports universal basic income in some capacity, and he supported Bernie Sanders. And like, this guy is not alt-right. He is not far right. It's just because he's a whatever athletic dude with tattoos who believes in the Second Amendment, and so he is the devil. But he is far from alt-right. So, but they try to demonize him. And what I was going to say is all the people that I see saying this stuff, they're all people who have never listened to a full episode of Joe Rogan. They even admit to it. They're like, I don't listen to him. I never would. He's just misinformation. It's like, okay, well, where are you coming up with this then? Because you just said you never listened to him. So why are you judging him and speaking as though you're an expert on his material? But again, folks, I've said it already a couple times. This is the world we live in. People just take a talking point from places like CNN, which we're going to talk about a lot later, and they just roll with it. And they don't care to do any research. They don't care to actually listen to Joe themselves. So we're all pulling for you, Joe. And I know you'll never hear this or listen to this, but just in general, the sentiment is all of us out here in alternative / independent / social media, we're cheering him on because he represents free speech. He truly does. He has folks on from all different sides of an argument. Like I said, he had Sanjay Gupta on from CNN, made Sanjay look pretty bad, and it'll probably be tough to get anybody to come back on there from that network or who shares similar beliefs or runs with the same narrative that Sanjay runs with. But Joe wasn't mean to him. He was very cordial. They had a good intellectual exchange, a good back and forth. he showed Sanjay some studies that Sanjay wasn't even aware of, which is a little bit alarming when you're the chief medical correspondent for a network and you're the one everyone's listening to. Again, even though Joe has a much larger listenership. Joe had on someone who is now on President Biden's vaccine council or something like that, I believe. He's had on Dr. Peter Hotez, who's a very pro-vaccine doctor who he had on at the beginning of the pandemic. They just cherry pick different episodes to make him look bad. But when you look at everything, Joe talks to everybody. And that's why we love him. And when I say we, I mean all of us in the podcast world, the YouTube world, social media world. That's what we should all aspire to be. And he will say on the show when he's wrong, and they'll look stuff up in real time. When have you ever seen that happen on Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, any of the cable news networks? Never. Never. When have you ever seen anybody admit that they're wrong on any of those networks? Never. So that's why we appreciate Joe Rogan.